This is the Permaculture Podcast. I'm Scott Mann. In this conversation, Rebecca Anderson joins Mary and Andrew to discuss her work with National Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, a government body under the purview of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Steeped in permaculture, with a degree in environmental science and resource management, who has also spent time as a woofer, Rebecca shares what the NRCS provides and what she does in her job to support anyone interested in conserving soil, water, and other natural resources with technical and financial support. As a permaculture practitioner, I recommend listening to this conversation because assistance from NRCS is free and isn't just for farmers. It's also easy to start the process. All you need to do is contact your local NRCS office. Enjoy this conversation with Rebecca, and I'll join you again after.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Permaculture Podcast. My name is Andrew Tuttle with Edge Perma and the Permaculture Podcast.
And I'm Mary Marshall. I'm the co-host and also collaborate with Edge Perma as well.
Yeah, and today we're joined with our friend Rebecca Anderson Balanca. And Rebecca works for the NRCS. And today we are going to be talking all about funding permaculture projects with working with the NRCS.
But the cool thing with Rebecca is that I believe you have a background in permaculture. Is that right?
That is right. I went through my PDC in Austin with the Austin Permaculture Guild, and I think it was 2017. And so, went through it while I was also working for NRCS. So that was a cool kind of overlay between the world of permaculture and then, the world of the feds.
Awesome. What was some of your background before that? Did you grow up around agriculture?
Kind of. So I grew up in Olympia, Washington, and my parents were both in the natural resources. So my mom is still a pasture management specialist and an agronomist, and my dad was a wildlife biologist. And so, grew up in the natural resources world here in Olympia, always surrounded by people in the natural resources, going out to field walks with my mom. So that was pretty cool. It kind of taught me what I was going to be doing with my life, even though I rebelled against it, as most of us do, right? I was like, no way am I going to be doing what my parents do, but here I am. So, I kind of grew up in it. And then, in college, I was working towards my fisheries degree, but I took a break, a sabbatical, I like to call it, from the University of Washington, where I was doing my fisheries degree, and I woofed. And so for about a year, I farm hopped around the US. I was on farms in California, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. And so the farms that I really focused on getting to were those focused on regenerative ag, permaculture, things like that, so I could get like a hands-on experience with it. And that was so amazing. And it really like set me on my course kind of. And so when I came back from my year of woofing, I was like, okay, well, better get my degree, I guess. Like, I don't want to have wasted that money. And so I came back to UW in Seattle. I was like, okay, so how am I going to create my path so that I can either farm myself or help farmers? And so, I ended up majoring in environmental science and resource management with minors in fisheries and nutrition because I was kind of trying to create a food systems degree, which didn't exist at that point at UW, but it does now. And so, kind of looking at that broad landscape scale design and planning process. And so then I was obviously like into permaculture, into like everything that goes with it. Graduated and I got on an internship with NRCS. I applied everywhere in the country except for Washington because I was like, no way am I going to stay home. And so Texas was the first place it took me. So I went down and I ended up in Anson, Texas, a little town of 2,000 people just north of Abilene. And I loved it. So I ended up staying and so kind of worked my way up through like the NRCS world, going from an intern to a soil conservationist, which is, a local county planner. And I kind of hopped around different counties there, going from Central Texas to deep Southeast Texas and back to Central Texas again. And, while I was kind of in my transition phase from going from an intern to a real live planner. That's when I was just outside of Austin, Texas. I was in LaGrange, so about an hour east of Austin. And so that's where, I was kind of searching for the Permi community and I found it. And Austin permaculture scene is a really, really great one. So shout out to Austin Permaculture Guild.
That's so great. I find it just so interesting that your story started out almost following in your parents' footsteps. Like I never would have thought this was the family biz. But so
Neither did I. Yeah.
But so cool that you've been able to morph your permaculture interest with working with something like the NRCS. I think that that's super great because so many people do their PDC and then don't know what steps to take moving forward. All they know is they want to make a positive impact and have an ethically driven career. Would you be able to dive into what the NRCS is, maybe what it stands for even, and give the basics on, what it is that the NRCS provides?
Yeah, and what you do there.
Yeah, awesome. So NRCS, government alphabet soup, right? So it stands for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but that's a mouthful. And so it is a sub-agency under USDA. So NRCS was actually established in like 1935 as the Soil Conservation Service, and it was established in response to farming practices that resulted in the Dust Bowl. And so it was formed as a way to kind of talk with different farmers and help them plan out different ways to conserve soil, right? We were kind of technical for the vast majority of the existence of NRCS, and that's kind of transformed in the last couple of years here when we started having financial assistance programs available to landowners and land operators. We have two sides to NRCS, basically the technical assistance, which is going out and having a chat on a property about different challenges you might be having and different goals you might have and like how to get you to where you want to be. And then we have our financial assistance side of NRCS, which is basically forming what we call conservation plans and hopefully getting folks financial assistance in the form of reimbursements in order to help them implement these different conservation practices out on their land. So NRCS is a non-regulatory agency, meaning that we can't make you do anything that you don't want to do on your land, and enrollment in our programs is fully voluntary. And so basically we work with folks to benefit, what we call SWAPA, soil, water, air, plants, and animals, to increase conservation on private lands. A really important aspect of I think what I just said is that you don't have to own land in order to, request assistance from us. You can be an operator on a piece of land. So if you have a handshake deal, if you've got a year-to-year lease, you can come in and request assistance in the form of technical or financial assistance. So we do help everyone. We help farmers, ranchers, backyard gardeners, entities like LLCs, nonprofits, tribes, just about everybody. And there is no minimum or maximum size to the property where people are requesting their help, right? It can literally be your backyard. Another question we get is, I don't sell any produce, I don't sell any meat, like, can I still request assistance from you? Yes, absolutely. If you're just producing food for yourself, for your family, you can totally come in and request assistance. And assistance is free. We are funded by the Farm Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. Your tax dollars pay our salaries, so any assistance that you request is completely free to you for us, coming out there and having a chat with you. What I do within NRCS, I started out as a local county planner. NRCS does have local offices in every single county, in every single state across the country. So that's really, really important, because there's always somebody local there to assist you, for you to contact and to kind of act as an expert for your county. So that's for your local ecoregion, right? It's one thing to say, hey, I know basically like how NRCS runs, but what's really, really key is knowing and specializing in a specific region in a county, because everything's so completely different across the country, across every state, and even within counties, right? So having a local expert there is super key. And I guess kind of like the process is normally folks call in to their local offices and they request assistance. They say, I have this concern, I have this problem, I have this weed or this brush out in my pasture. I don't know what it is and I don't know how to get rid of it. Can you come out and can you tell me something about it? Or, I don't have any grass for my livestock. What should I do here? Or I need a high tunnel. Can you come out and talk to me about it? And we're like, sure. And so the local county planners run out and they start a conversation with the producer out there, right? Talking about challenges, goals, and ways to get you to where you want to be. So that's kind of where I started with NRCS. And then, you can hop between different county offices depending on where your life takes you, right? And so, I was in Texas for 7 years before my family and we decided it was time to come back up north and be closer to my family up here. And so I transferred from being a county planner in Central Texas to being a county planner for Thurston County here in Washington. And then NRCS actually created my new position, which is the Small Farms and Urban Agriculture Specialist for the state of Washington. So I just transitioned into this new position. It hadn't existed before, really. And so it was kind of created in response to our national office putting a higher priority on small farms and urban agriculture in general. What I do now is I kind of act as a specialist for the local county planners, right? Because people come in with all sorts of different degrees, whether it's environmental science, wildlife degrees, range management degrees, soil science degrees. So they come into the agency with different areas of specialization, but our county planners more act as generalists, jack of all trades. You have to know crops, you have to know pasture, you have to know range, you have to know forestry, right? I act as a specialist for small farm systems, permaculture through the HMI, Holistic Management International training. While I was in Texas as well, I also went through Elaine Ingham's Soul Food Web School. I'm into all the things associated with permaculture, right? I'm into biodynamics, I'm into Korean natural farming. So when folks get requests from people for these alternative systems, they come to me and they're like, hey, so this is what this producer says they're trying to do. How does that kind of translate into the world of NRCS? Can you tell me a little bit something about this alternative system? And so I kind of see myself as acting as a translator, again, between permaculture or KNF or whatever it is, right? And NRCS, and kind of overlaying how we can work within the federal system in order to get people to where they want to be when they're looking at working with these different alternative, non-conventional management systems. And I also do a lot of training for the state of Washington for our newer planners here. I work on creating new practices that don't exist. We're working on one right now that's looking at creating a practice for culturally significant plantings. I work on creating new scenarios, right? Because we have different reimbursement scenarios for different practices. Let's take mulching, for example. We have different scenarios that include things like a scenario for geotextile, a scenario for plastic, a scenario for wood chips, a scenario for natural materials, which could include leaves or straw or something like that. Right. And so basically, if something doesn't exist and there's a need for it from the field, from the producers, we look at ways to create that for people. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about your work at NRCS. So Becca, you and I met last fall at the Farm Expo in Monroe. And your talk just totally blew me away. I just had to stay late and talk to you and get to know you. And then, we ended up you came out to the farm a couple weeks ago, and we're working on the process of applying for NRCS funding here at Bragtree Farm. But just getting to know you a bit about your story and your passion and the work that you're doing. I just think that you're really living so many people's kind of dream career pathway. You said you're a translator earlier for translating Korean natural farming and biodynamics and bringing that into this government entity and helping people establish these farm systems on their site. I'm just curious, Can you describe what does it feel like to get to practice permaculture principles and see this work in action on a day-to-day basis?
Dude, it's the dream, honestly. Like, I talk about this with my husband all the time because, like, he's living his dream career and so am I. And so, yeah, it's super amazing because I kind of look at what I'm doing as so it's kind of like, growing up in Olympia, like, there's a lot of counterculture here. You know, growing up, I never thought that I would work within the federal government, right? But once you're kind of through the system and you're looking at ways to effectively make change, you can work outside the system and you can kind of like bang up against the walls. And we've all been there and we've all done that. I think ways to effectively make change are working within the system and kind of changing it at the core as much as you can, and then like spreading it out from there. So it's I'm still kind of shocked that I have this job because I'm like, how is this a real thing? Right? Like I get to like live the Permy dream, like low key, there's highs and lows to working within the government, but it's super, super cool. I get to go out, I get to make site visits with folks like y'all who are out there getting this work on the ground, and we get to support y'all in the best way that we can.
Yeah, I love hearing that you get to see these projects and change happen in real time, and you're able to keep tabs on people and see their land improve and be a part of that process. What are some of the projects that you've been able to help facilitate or have been involved with the NRCS funds?
Oh man, so many.
I bet.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I'll use a couple examples from Texas just because like within Washington itself, it's kind of where people expect permaculture to like thrive and grow and be super, super obvious, have all the hippie permies like everywhere around here. So I kind of like using Texas as an example for it because it's what people think of as conventional so much more of the time. But I also see like these maybe more rural, maybe more conventional areas as, these areas just have so much potential, right? For more change, for bigger change. And so I guess before I go into like projects that we did, I just want to say like also on the topic of translation and everything, being able to effectively communicate these different Permy ideas, whether it's stacking functions or whether it's zones or whatever, and communicate it to maybe more conventional people who are farming corn, cotton, wheat, and milo, or people who are running, some more conventional grazing operations, being able to talk to them about implementing different forbs into their pastures, right? And treating these forbs as a vitamin store, where you can get your animals different minerals that they might need in a different way than just like feeding them out of a mineral tub, right? And so being able to communicate with them these ideas of, herbal lays or whatever, but in terminology that they might understand, communicating it and relaying it all back to, the economics of it. And I really find that to be really empowering for Permies in general, right? But it's like, I find a lot of times that Permies might get a little bit like pigeonholed. They might pigeonhole themselves, and so it's like only looking at things and being able to communicate them in one way. And so I think it's really important for us to be able to diversify and look at different ways to communicate these really, really important ideas to people who might not be familiar with them, right? Because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to get effective change on the ground. Yeah, so I think that's a really key part of it in these rural areas. And then, different projects that got implemented that have been like really inspiring. In Texas, in Central Texas specifically, like I mentioned, there's a lot of conventional farmers, corn, cotton, wheat, and milo, who are tilling a lot. They're spraying a lot of chemicals and everything, which, everyone has different tools in their toolbox and they're going to utilize different management practices at different times. But, within these communities, there's people who are looking for help in ways to become more regenerative, more sustainable. So there was a dude with like 5 acres in the middle of all this conventional farming. And so he had a homestead with his family. And so he had a little like mini CSA with pastured poultry and some crops that he was growing. And so he came into NRCS, into our field office, and he was asking about our high tunnel reimbursements that we have. And so, I went out there and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm into this permaculture thing. You're into this permaculture thing?" I was like, "Yeah." We super connected. And so he was like, "Wow, I didn't know that people within NRCS were knowledgeable about this and they could actually help out here." I think a lot of times people also think that NRCS is like just the high tunnel people, right? But we have like so many different practices that we can help with that overlay permaculture so beautifully. And I guess I'll get into that a little bit later. But, so we got him a grant, or not grant, we do reimbursements, not grants, for a couple of high tunnels on his place through our EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So that's a program that's more for infrastructure level practices. We usually keep those contracts about 1 to 3 years long. And I mean, that's for a couple of reasons. And so it keeps it easier to implement for the farmer, right? If you're looking at a contract that's 1 to 3 years, and also our reimbursement rates change a little bit every year. So having them planned only about 3 years out, it kind of keeps it easier in terms of the reimbursement actually covering a reasonable amount of any practice that's getting installed. But, he came in and he applied for high tunnels. We got him those contracts, and then kind of transitioned him super beautifully into our other big financial assistance program, which is called CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. So folks usually enter into CSP once they've got their management history established, they've got most of their infrastructure in place, they're already doing a good job, and they want to do an even better job. And we want to incentivize them to keep doing that. So CSP is a 5-year contract where basically we incentivize you to install what are called enhancements, which are kind of like practices plus, right? Practices with a little sparkle. Through EQIP, folks normally do things like install high tunnels, low tunnels, hedgerows, cover crops, crop rotation, cross fencing, livestock water systems, stuff like that. And then really the infrastructure practices, the management practices, right? And then through CSP, you're usually looking at doing something like, if you have a hedgerow already, you're looking at lengthening that hedgerow, widening that hedgerow, diversifying that hedgerow, right? So basically like taking what you already have and making it even better, making it even more effective. We got this guy enrolled in CSP, and through that program, he did things like he planted out a bunch of pollinator plantings. A bunch of it was specifically for monarchs because Central Texas, right? And then we did things like installing him a hedgerow along some of his fence lines because, he's surrounded by these conventional farmers, right, who are doing things like flying on pesticides and things like that. And so we wanted to create him a barrier, basically, against spray and pesticide drift and everything. So we got that planned in there. We also got some grazing planned in there. And so, we took what could have just been like a simple high tunnel contract, right? Just you're in, you're out, you get your high tunnels. But we kind of transformed it into an even better site design, right? Because, he and I worked together to kind of lay out where exactly he needed these different things on his property so that he could really take his grazing to the next level for his pastured poultry, so that he could really take advantage of the monarchs that were coming through, the pollinators that were coming through, and intersperse them between his crop fields and between his high tunnels. And then in that same county, another really, really like amazing project was these. Okay, so it was like a 2,000 acre farm. It's been in the same family since like Texas became a state. It's been owned by the same family, and they've been leasing it out to, other farmers in the area since like the 70s. So for like 50 years, right? So generally, when other folks are leasing out your property, they're not going to take as good a care of it as you do. It's pretty well known, and it's a consistent challenge. But on this, 2,000 acre property, there were a couple different generations that had all come together and decided, like, you know what, we need to start working this land again. We want to do better by it. And so we're going to actually take control back from the tenants. And it had been all in conventional cotton, corn, wheat, and milo because, I mean, again, Central Texas, and that's what the commodities are there. So we worked on a project to plant them first to a cover crop to get some nutrient cycling, to get the soil covered, to get the soil built back up for organisms to really thrive out there. So we planned out a cover crop, and then we planned out to plant all of the fields to a tall grass native prairie mix. And so, all the big grasses, big blue stem, little blue stems, side oats, switchgrass, eastern game of grass, stuff like that. These guys were going to plant all of their fields, like all 2,000 acres, into this native grass mix. They had also gone to a course on regenerative grazing, and so their plan was to get all of their animals, move them in one large herd across these 2,000 acres with hot wires in order to really, really effectively get that herd effect on the native grassland and then give it a huge amount of rest so it could grow back before they hit it again for the next grazing session. So the young guy who was a part of that family, he was also into permaculture. And so he had experience with irrigation systems too. And so he was a really, really great person to work with, really, because he was like, yeah, let's do it. And then his dad, who was also coming back into the picture, he was like, the son would get the dad stoked on it. And the dad was like, a businessman. And then there was a doctor in the picture too. And so, it's like everyone was working together to get each other stoked on these projects, and it was super, super great. And they were just so open to trying pretty much anything that like we came up with, And so we talked about putting in, trees on keyline, about grazing on keyline. And so we also worked to put into a contract a livestock water system to support this rotational grazing pattern. And so, talking about putting in a well, a pump, an above ground storage facility that would then gravity flow down into different troughs and allow them to move their animals through these different pastures. So those were probably my two favorites in that Central Texas region, just because, oh my goodness, what dream clients to work with.
Wow, those are really inspiring projects. And, back to that lecture that you did last fall, like, remember when I first started hearing you speak about these different projects that NRCS funds, and I was like, wait a second, this is just a permaculturist that infiltrated the government here.
And the fact that I just love hearing about these farms that you've been on and how much of a personalized experience it is or interactive process it is when you're going on the farm and talking to the farmers about what their goals are and seeing what systems are already established and how you can work within them. I just think that's really cool because they're such complex systems. I guess the other thing that popped into my head was, what about farms that maybe don't have a lot going on yet? It's almost like it sounds like you're a counselor or a guidance counselor. And when you step onto the land, you're helping essentially design these farms. Is that something that you lean into with, maybe smaller farms? Are there limitations with that? And do you do full-blown designs for people, basically?
Mm. So, in terms of the land size, like I mentioned earlier, there's no minimum and no maximum size to come in and work with us. And so we've made visits for everybody from backyard gardeners to community gardens who have different folks who are leasing out plots, whether they're 3 foot by 20 foot or, whatever it is. And so we work with all sizes of operations. And again, you can own the land, but you can also operate the land. In terms of a permaculture design, I have helped people with that like a little bit before, but honestly, like most of the time when we're going out there, it's interesting, right? Because, you go out there and you talk with somebody and you're like, okay, so what are your goals out here? And so really we talk about, well, I guess I'll say this. A lot of times people come in and they tell us what they want to do, right? They're like, I need this fence here. I need this high tunnel here. I need to store water here. Whatever it is, right? And I think it's the same idea, whether somebody's coming into NRCS for assistance or whether somebody's coming into, a permaculture design business for assistance. They come in and they tell you what they want. I want berms and swales. I want hugelkultur, whatever it is. And I mean, I think it's really important for us both as permaculture designers, but also as NRCS, right? Like we have to kind of take a step back and we're like, okay, so what I'm hearing is that you want to store more water in your soil, right? And so maybe berms and swales are the way to get you there. But maybe we should take a step back and we should take a look at things like implementing some perennial grass cover. Maybe that's going to work better for your situation. Maybe we should talk about cover crops. Maybe we should talk about food forests underlaid with wood chips on contour, whatever it is, right? And kind of take a step back from like pushing a prescription to more looking at all the options that we have, because there's the allistic side of it and there's the holistic side of it. I think that's really important just across the board, right? So when we do go out and we look at a landscape, a lot of times, whether we're permaculture designers or whether we're NRCS, we start out doing a little background research on the place, right? We pull up our aerial maps, our soils maps, our topographic maps, and we're like, okay, we know what we're getting ourselves into. We can see where this root restrictive layer is in the soil. We can see the spot down here is wet and boggy. The spot up here is high and dry, right? We know that going into a site visit. And then when we get out there, we kind of ground truth what we're seeing. And so, as the client is coming in and they're talking to us about their challenges and their goals and everything, we're like, okay, well, I see exactly what's going on here, right? Because you're telling me that you have this issue of this erosion over here, right? And so we can see that's right where, a draw comes through, where this water is getting concentrated. And so let's talk about different opportunities here. I think a lot of times it kind of does transform low key into a whole site design, right? Because, people have their right now plans, they have their 3-year plans, they have their 10-year plans and their 20-year plans. So you kind of, through having these conversations and getting to know these clients, they'll tell you what they're wanting to do. You kind of talk about that. You put the map on the hood of the truck or wherever you're at, right? And you kind of draw out everything where the producer or the client is interested in putting these different things. You talk about the different options out there. And so generally within NRCS, again, we're kind of looking at 3-year contracts for the infrastructure and the management level practices. And so we kind of bite it off in manageable chunks because, also with these site designs and with these plans, we have to acknowledge that things are going to change after a couple of years. Let's say people are coming in and they're applying for a high tunnel and a low tunnel, and they want to cover crop their open field and they want to put in a hedgerow. After they do that in the course of 3 years, their goals in their zones 3, 4, and 5, they might change, right? After they kind of bite off this first chunk of plan implementation out there. I'd say yes, and it's a continuous conversation between NRCS and the client, just like it is between permaculture designers and their clients. After you get one phase implemented, you have to kind of go back to the drawing board and you kind of have to reassess because things do change out on a site. Goals do change, stakeholders change, right? And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we're going through the planning process.
Yeah, I love to hear that you're really building relationships with people. You're building community and you're really changing people's lives. This amount of money that the government has to put into regenerative practices on farms, there's so many different projects that I personally would never be able to afford, but now we're looking at the possibility of all of these different NRCS projects. And I'm curious, that project, the 2,000-acre farm you worked on, do you happen to remember any of the numbers there as far as like what they were reimbursed for that? Or maybe if not that one, another project, could you share with them sort of some of the numbers on reimbursement rates and what that looks like on the financial side?
Well, okay. So I guess I'll go into a little bit on the reimbursement rates in general before I go into more specifics. The way our reimbursement rates work is the economists in DC, they look at a practice within a state. Let's take high tunnels, for example, because I talk about high tunnels all the time because I'm a small farm specialist. The economists in DC, they take a look at what it should cost to implement a high tunnel in the state of Washington, right? And they're like, okay, so averaged over the entire state, right? This is from Spokane in Eastern Washington to Ephrata in Central Washington to Olympia in Western Washington. They say, okay, over the average of the whole entire state, it should cost about, use easy numbers, $10 per square foot to implement a high tunnel. That's purchasing the kit, that's getting it delivered, that's the labor to put it up, all of it. So it should cost $10 per square foot to implement this high tunnel. But that's not the amount of reimbursement that the client is going to receive, right? And so we have two different reimbursement rates. One is for our historically underserved clients, and one is for non-historically underserved. One can qualify as a historically underserved client if you're one of 4 different groups. Okay, the first one is beginning farmers who've been farming for less than 10 consecutive years. The second is limited resource, and that's someone who makes less than half of the average income for the county. The third is socially disadvantaged, and so that's where you're a minority. And the fourth is a veteran farmer, and that's where you've either been honorably discharged within the last 10 years from the military, or you're a veteran and you have started farming within the last 10 years. And so historically underserved and non-historically underserved. If you're a historically underserved client, you're eligible to receive approximately 75 to 90% of what it should cost you to install a practice averaged over the whole state. If you're a non-historically underserved client, then you're eligible to receive about 50 to 75% of what it should cost you to install that practice. Let's again take a look at our high tunnel example. For that $10 per square foot, I guess I should say that's for your larger 30 by 96 Gothic high tunnel. Just because, again, that's what I see and talk about the most up here. So for our historically underserved clients, these numbers are for last year, right? But they were receiving about $7.60 per square foot to install that high tunnel. And then our non-historically underserved clients were receiving about $6.50 to implement that high tunnel. So that falls within the 75 to 90% and then the 50 to 75%, if that makes sense. So every single state in the country is going to have different reimbursement rates, right? Because again, these reimbursement rates are averaged over the state. I can send y'all the link for the different reimbursement rates for every state in the country, just because, I hate to give absolute numbers to folks since they're going to change over each state. And then, our reimbursement rates do change a little bit every year, just with inflation and the actual cost of things. After COVID, when things started going so high, there was a lot of change for our different practices out there because the cost of steel and PVC and everything just went up so crazy high so quickly. That's also, another reason why we encourage our folks to keep to, 3-year contracts, because we are dealing with this kind of like unprecedented low-key inflation out there right now. That's kind of a background on the reimbursement rates. I know that 2,000 acre farm that I had, their contracts were split up into like 3 separate contracts. So each of them, that was for a couple hundred acres of cover cropping, then range planting, and then a follow-up weed control, by shredding or mowing, right? And then follow-up deferment of grazing. I think they're getting, well, I hate to give hard numbers because this was also a couple of years ago, right? But I think it was about $70,000 per contract. But those numbers change all the time, and they were historically underserved. They were beginning farmers. So that's another aspect to it. But I would say overall, our reimbursement rates are pretty dang good. And I would encourage everybody, I would love it if y'all could put the link that I'm going to send you in the show notes, because it's pretty wild, honestly, like how much money we do reimburse for these different practices. But I'll also say that the link that I'm going to send you, it's about 100 pages long, because like I mentioned before, we do have so many different scenarios for every single practice. What I really encourage folks to do, if they are interested in any of these practices or any financial assistance program, is to give your local county planner a holler and get in contact with them, right? Because they're going to be the experts in kind of what you need out there, which scenario is going to best fit you, and also what maybe you don't want to go for, right? Because they're going to talk with you about the different reimbursement rates. And so when we're talking about implementing a hedgerow on somebody's property, we kind of split that into a suite of practices. And so we do a site preparation where we take off the existing vegetation, we do the actual planting of the hedgerow out there, and then we look at a follow-up mulching, whether it's a cardboard and wood chips, whether it's just wood chips, whatever it is. And then a follow-up weed control, generally with a push mower or weed whacker, whatever it is, depending on the size of the hedgerow. Looking at the different reimbursement rates for those 4 separate practices that are within the hedgerow suite, a lot of times, even with the reimbursement rates for like small scale farms, the follow-up weed control sometimes only pays $5 or $20 or something. People are like, I don't care that much. Don't include that in the contract. And we're like, cool, that totally makes sense. You're not forced to do anything within your contract that you don't want to do, like include a $5 weed whacking of your hedgerow. All that to say, like, everything is a conversation. I mean, just like with any design, you can talk about the moon and stars, right? You can talk about your pasture system. You can talk about implementing a hedgerow every 10th bed in your market garden. You can talk about putting in a cistern, whatever it is. But you don't have to bite it all off at once either.
I think that's an important thing to remember, because doing landscape designs and talking to clients about their farm and what they want to do, what their goals are, NRCS is constantly popping into my mind, because what an incredible resource it is to have this funding available. And so that's something that, as we've come up with the designs, that we mentioned to them to seek out these opportunities. As for the funding, are there other organizations that you collaborate with? What are some of the additional funding opportunities for farm projects that maybe wouldn't be covered with the NRCS?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So honestly, there's so many funding opportunities out there, and it's just kind of knowing where to look, right? A huge mass of Google searches, and it's so confusing. But I feel like once you get somebody out there, like from NRCS or from a conservation district who's kind of in that world, they can lead you more easily down the path of finding the funding. Within the state of Washington, for example, NRCS is a funding opportunity, and generally we cover some of the bigger cost projects out there, just because we have a little bit deeper pockets. A lot of times we will partner with our local conservation districts because they also have some really great funding opportunities. Generally, their funds are allocated quicker than ours because they're more of a first come, first serve type of deal compared to us, where we take applications year round, but we kind of have to wait and batch our applications about once a year. And I will say conservation districts are different across the country. In Washington, our conservation districts are super well funded, and in Texas they really weren't that well funded. And so there's a difference in the amount that goes back into the community based off of how the conservation districts are funded. But so they're a good one. In Washington, there's also the Tilth Alliance, which they've got some really great funding. WSDA, the Washington State Department of Agriculture, they've got a few different grant programs. Their biggest one that I generally aim people towards is their local infrastructure grant. So a lot of times, WSDA's local infrastructure grant, they cover more post-harvest types of projects, right? So it could be a delivery van, it could be a walk-in, it could be a cool bot, it could be, a wash pack station or a deer fence or something like that, right? NRCS projects are generally more aimed at like the pre-harvest side of things. And so, actually implementing your high tunnel, implementing your cross fence, implementing cover crops, things like that. And so that's how I kind of see the distinction between those two. I know that WSDA's local infrastructure grant, they used to run their approval programs once a year, but now I think they're putting out 2 a year. So that's super, super great. Rodale has a mini grant program for BIPOC producers, I believe. So I aim people towards that. And, in every single state, the funding opportunities are going to look slightly different, right? That's where I encourage you to, or anybody listening, to like reach out to their local folks and kind of get them linked in with other local agencies, because state agencies, federal agencies, we've all got different programs for different things. I will also say U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. They look at funding projects that benefit different threatened and endangered species. For example, in Thurston County, Washington, we have the endangered Mazama pocket gopher. A lot of the pocket gopher soils are in some of the prairie soils that still exist. Some are that still have, ranches and farms on them. On these different soils for the gophers, right? Because everything has to be connected to a threatened or endangered species pretty much for that program, or the potential for one of those species to rehabilitate that area. They can do things that we can't, like implementing boundary fences. That's a big thing with NRCS fencing, right? We can do cross fencing, but we can't necessarily do boundary fencing. That's where, linking up with these different agencies and also getting the different people from the different agencies out on a joint site visit on properties to take a look at the map and be like, okay, so this is the overall plan for the next 3 years. NRCS, we can take the cross fencing and the water systems. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, can you take the boundary fencing? Conservation district, can you take some of the riparian forest habitat or whatever it is? So everyone kind of works together to get the producer to where they want to be.
That's so great. We're all on the same team, right?
Totally.
Yeah, so many resources to explore. Our show notes are going to be loaded with links. So we'll definitely fill that up. Do you know, is there other countries that have NRCS or similar organizations to the NRCS?
I think I've heard of other countries like the UK who have essentially like area specialists for agriculture or forestry, but I'm not sure it's in the same way. But I have heard of some programs like in the UK that cover kind of similar projects. But honestly, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to speak out of turn.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the opportunities are out there. And like you were saying, they may vary state by state as well. So
For sure.
yeah, I think it's important to lean into researching what is provided locally as well as with the NRCS, which is within all of the US.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say, NRCS does have planners also in the territories. And so if somebody's in Puerto Rico, if somebody's in Guam, like there are planners there to assist those people in those territories as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Super dope.
yeah. Becca, this has been amazing. We got to spend like almost 4 hours with you a couple weeks ago when we did our initial site visit with you and our local planner, Josh. And that was so cool. It's been amazing to get to like hear more today. Can you, is there any like closing thoughts you'd love to share with our audience?
Well, a few things. I do want to like shout out some of our, n- you know, newer, different, smaller scale practices that we have available for folks. Some of our more common practices are things like high tunnels, low tunnels, hedgerows, mulching, cover crops, crop rotation, pollinator plantings, windbreaks, and then like grazing practices, cross fences, and livestock water systems. We do also have a really big push for agroforestry right now. Things like alley cropping, forest farming, silvopasture, riparian forest buffers. That's playing in huge in terms of where the focus is going nationally and also kind of where funds are going nationally. And then some of our newer practices that we have available are low tunnels, like I mentioned earlier, like super, super great practice, really applicable for people, whether it's on lease land or smaller scale farms. Then we also have soil carbon amendment, which is compost and biochar. We also have soil liming. We also have raised beds. We have annual forages for grazing systems. Some states have temporary electric fence scenarios, which is super, super great and super amazing for people who are looking to rotationally graze. And we also have a practice for organic management systems, which is where essentially we help to look at and create an organic management plan along with the producer and then, getting their certifier involved, right? Because the certifier has the final word for any organic anything for certification. And I also want to say, a lot of people don't like to look to different federal or state grant or reimbursement programs a lot of times because these programs within NRCS specifically, they're funded by tax dollars, right? And so I look at it as, if you don't apply for these programs, somebody else is going to, and somebody else is going to get the money, right? So you may as well apply for these programs and get some of what you paid into the system coming back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we would highly recommend anyone listening out there today, please look into NRCS funding, contact your field advisor, set up a meeting, start talking about ways you can implement regenerative practices on the land that you're stewarding or land that you own. I love that there's opportunities for people leasing land, there's opportunities for people that own land, and there's just so many different projects that you all fund. And I just am thrilled to have gotten more into those offerings with you today. So yeah, please go check out the NRCS and follow the links in the show notes to learn more about all of this.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll note is when we were walking around on the land, I had ideas of where I thought I needed to prioritize our work on the farm here. And walking around with you and just even knowing the timeline for which funding is available really helped navigate where we want to start. And I think that's a huge thing. That was extremely beneficial, is just putting our heads together and figuring out, what the first step is. So I just highly recommend for people to contact you all and get the ball rolling.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me on here today. This is super great.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. This has been amazing. This was such a great conversation, and we really appreciate you for joining in and sharing your insights with our audience.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat about anything if, more NRCS stuff comes up or whatever, and look forward to working with y'all on y'all's place out there as well.
Yeah, same. So good to chat with you today, Becca.
Awesome.
And that was Rebecca Anderson. Find out more about NRCS by visiting NRCS.usda.gov. Rebecca also passed along a list of additional links she recommends checking out, which you'll find in the resource section of the show notes. What I love about this conversation is threefold. To start us off, this is the first interview from Mary and Andrew where I wasn't familiar with the guest, their work, or knew very much about the topic. I'm excited that they have connections that I don't, and who they are able to bring onto the show that I'm not familiar with to expand our reach and understanding of the breadth of permaculture. Second is that Rebecca found a degree that aligns with her permaculture interests and went back to school to have those experiences, something that I did years after starting the Permaculture podcast. I found that experience vital to being able to learn the grammar, lexicon, and lingo of other natural resource professionals and people who are just interested in these subjects. Knowing all of that makes it a lot easier to go to a farm or a garden center or any park or natural space, really, and have a conversation with the people who are the professionals there. You kind of learn some of those shibboleths to be able to talk to them, and they know you're someone who's informed and knows what it is that they do, and it can help bolster your respect for one another and your ability to work together by learning these different things outside of our area of specialty. The third thing that I loved about this interview is that Rebecca was able to turn her interests and experiences into a job that helps permies grow what it is that they want to do and better communicate our abilities and needs to produce effective change on the ground. It reminds me of David Holmgren sharing with me that the original vision for his work was that it would turn into a series of permacultures. Yes, plural. So that each of us would practice these ideas in our own lives, where we are, wherever we found ourselves. And what I like about permaculture as it continues to expand and grow is that there are a lot of folks out there doing good work that want to help us make the difference we want to see in the world. All we have to do is find them, seek them out, and ask for their help. But those are just my thoughts at this time, in this moment. What are yours? Get in touch and let us know. Call 717-827-6266. Email show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. You can also reach us electronically by visiting thepermaculturepodcast.com, click on Contact, and send us a direct message. You can also reach us electronically by visiting thepermaculturepodcast.com, clicking on Contact, and sending us a direct message. If you prefer, you can also drop something in the mail. That address is The Permaculture Podcast, P.O. Box 2509, Falls Church, Virginia, 22042. From here, the next new interview is a conversation with Byron Burse, which will be out in a few weeks. Once we release that show, we'll be taking a short break and returning with new episodes and the fall 2024 season, starting on September 22nd for patrons, patreon.com/the Permaculture Podcast, and September 29th everywhere else. Until the next time, spend each day conserving natural resources, remembering to ask for help when you need it, while taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other. This episode of the Permaculture Podcast is a collaboration between Scott Mann of Permaneo Group, LLC, and Mary Marshall and Andrew Tuttle of Edge Perma. Find out more about our individual projects at permaneogroup.com and edgeperma.com, respectively. Find our collaborative free learning community at bit.ly/the Permaculture Collective.